So let's work on that meal item form now, which allows us to add items to the cart. For this, we already added the meal item form JS file here in the meal item folder, but of course it's empty right now. We will also need some styling, so again, attached you find a meal item.module.css file so that we don't have to write the styles manually here. Now in the meal item form.js file, we of course want to create our meal item form component function, and this will receive some props here. And we of course export this function here. Now we can also already import the style classes with import classes from meal item form.module.css and then start with the JSX markup for this component. Now here I want to render a form element, and in there we want to have an input like this, and we want to have a button. So therefore here we can add both. Now for this input, I will actually wrap that into a separate component so that we have a reusable input which we could use in other parts of an application as well. I'll do this as a second step though. As a first step, let's finish the button. For that, I'll simply say add on it, because that button will add it to the cart. Maybe add a plus in front of add as well. And of course, add a class on the overall form with class name and set this equal to classes.form, like this. Now we can go to the meal item JS file and import that meal item form component, meal item form, from meal item form like this, and output it here between the div. Now if we save this, we have something like this, which is not the final look, but which is a start. Now for the final look, as I said, I want to extract that input into a reusable pre-styled input component, which could be used in multiple parts of the application. Again, just as with the card and a lot of these examples here, not because this here would be a super huge application, but because these are realistic scenarios in bigger applications you might be working on, that you want to have these reusable pre-styled utility components like inputs or maybe also buttons and so on, which you use in a lot of different places of your application. And therefore in the UI folder, I will add an input.js file, which will be responsible for rendering that input. And therefore attached, you also find the input.module.css file with styling for that input. Now in there, I will, of course, again, create my component function as we did it multiple times already. And of course, we'll import these classes, import classes from input.module.css. And then here, we can return the markup for this input. And in this case, I want to have a div here with a class name of classes.input for the styling. And then there, a label with some text for the input, and then the input itself. Now you could definitely write this in a lot of different ways, maybe even letting the user of this component decide whether you want an input or a select or a text area here. But to keep things simple here, we'll just always render an input. Now of course the label text should be configurable, and therefore the text output here is props.label. Though, of course, it's totally up to you which prop name you're expecting this name on. I will also set the HTML4 prop here to set the for attribute, like class. You don't set class or for, but in the case of class, it's class name in JSX. In the case of for, it's HTML4, because both class and for are reserved keywords in JavaScript. And here I will then point at props and then input.id. Again, this is my component, so I can decide which kind of props I expect and which structure these props should have. And I simply expect here that for this input component, when it's getting used, I get a label prop with the label text and an input prop, which then itself holds an object with configuration data for the input, like for example the ID, which we therefore then also add as the ID prop here on the input. So props.input.id. In addition, I will now use a nice little trick to pass all other configuration data I might have gotten for this input to this input element here as props. I add curly braces here, just like this, and then use the spread operator to spread props.input. This ensures that all the key value pairs in this input object, which we receive on props input, are added as props to input. So if input object here is an object that, for example, has type text, so if that is what we get on props input, for example, then this code here would make sure that type equals text is being added. This is how that works when you use the spread operator on an element like this. It's simply a convenient way of making this input highly configurable from outside this component through this input prop here. And of course, therefore, we can even get rid of this ID if we want to, and simply expect that this ID is part of this input prop as well, which we already do expect here, and then therefore also add it automatically through this syntax as a prop to this input element. Now, and with that added, we can of course go back to the meal item form component and there import input from going up, UI, input, and then replacing this input here with input as a self-closing tag. And there I will now add the label prop, because I'm expecting a label prop here with some text inside of it, with a label of amount. And then the input prop, which now itself should hold an object. So here the value is an object like this, hence the double curly braces. It's no special syntax. Instead, we have one pair of curly braces to evaluate a JavaScript expression, which is passed in as a value. And then that expression just happens to be a JavaScript object. Hence, we have that other pair of curly braces. And in that object, I want to have an ID, which is amount, let's say, type, which is number, and this is one of the built-in input element types. And I'll add some validation props as well, which are all props you can add by default to the input element. And that would be the min prop with 1 and the max prop with 5, to make sure that the amount that can be added has to be at least 1, but is not bigger than 5. I'll add the step prop, which is also supported on the input element, and set this to 1. And also provide a default value of 1, so that this is the initial value with which this input is populated. And again, these are all default props which you can add to any input element. So these are not props which we need to interpret and handle. Instead, we just distribute them onto the input through this syntax, and then they automatically start making sense because these are all built-in props for input elements. And if we now save that, this is what we got. And that looks, of course, very, very nice. Now, with that, we built a lot of components. And we still got the card component to build, but thereafter, we are finally ready to also start working on the logic of this application and to add context to manage the card, for example. But of course, building all these components that is the meat of basically any React application you are going to build. And therefore, I'm walking through that process again with you because you need to know how you can build components, how you can use components. That is super crucial and therefore an important practice. And with that, let's build that card modal, and thereafter, let's finally wire everything up and add more logic to this application.